Horror lovers. If you crave spine-chilling tales that linger long after the lights go out, you're in the right place. Tonight, we'll dive into a story that will have you questioning every shadow and shiver in the dark. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a moment of the eerie, the unsettling, and the unknown. Let's see if you can make it to the end of this terrifying tale, if you dare. Story 1. The Caretaker's Watch. Thomas had worked as the caretaker of the old cemetery for nearly a decade. The job was solitary, and over the years, he had become accustomed to the silence that blanketed the graveyard as night fell. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the cemetery seemed to come alive in its own way, with shadows stretching across the stone graves and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Yet, there was always an eerie sense of quiet that filled the air, as though the spirits of the dead were waiting, watching. One chilly evening, as Thomas walked past the oldest graves, something caught his eye. At first, it was a flicker, a fleeting figure standing by one of the weathered gravestones. His heart skipped a beat, dismissing it as just a trick of the light. But as he walked closer, his eyes locked onto the figure again, this time unmistakably clear. It was a tall, thin silhouette, standing perfectly still, staring at the gravestones. He felt a chill run down his spine. No one was supposed to be here at this time of night. Curiosity gnawed at him, but fear held him back. The figure did not move. It simply watched. Over the next few nights, Thomas could not shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. Every evening, as he passed the oldest section of the graveyard, he would see that same figure in the distance, watching from behind the weathered tombstones. It became almost routine. And yet, the closer Thomas got, the more the air seemed to thicken, suffocating him. The figure never moved, never blinked, it just watched. One evening, unable to suppress his curiosity any longer, Thomas decided to confront the figure. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the more his unease grew. And then, as if sensing his presence, the figure turned its head slowly towards him. The face was obscured by shadows, but Thomas could feel its hollow gaze bore into him, as though it could see right through him. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, though his voice trembled slightly. The figure didn't respond, but after a long pause, it slowly raised one hand and pointed to a nearby gravestone. Thomas's breath hitched. He walked to the grave, the ground beneath his boots feeling colder with each step. When he reached the stone, his fingers brushed against the cool surface, and that's when he saw it. The name carved into the stone, Thomas Mallory. His own name. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. The figure wasn't just a ghost, it was a harbinger, a being that marked those who were soon to die. The figure disappeared into the night without a sound, leaving Thomas in a cold sweat, alone with the grim message. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay awake, his mind racing with questions. What did it mean? Why was it pointing to his grave? The figure had left him with more questions than answers. and an ever-deepening dread began to take root in his mind. Over the next few days, he continued his rounds at the cemetery. But every night, the figure appeared closer. At first, it was far off in the distance, standing near the oldest graves. But with each passing night, it drew nearer, always watching, its hollow eyes never leaving Thomas. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. Thomas could hear it whispering on the wind, though its words were indecipherable. The eerie whispering grew louder with each passing night. And on the third night after the encounter, Thomas could swear he heard names being whispered, names he recognized. James, Claire, Sarah, the figure murmured, its voice like the wind through the trees. The names were of people he knew. The dead. The ones buried in this very cemetery. But then, a name that chilled him to his core, Thomas. His heart skipped a beat. And in the reflection of the nearby gravestones, he saw the figure watching him. Its head tilted slightly, as if to savor his fear. No, Thomas whispered to himself. This can't be real. It's just my imagination. But the whispers continued, growing louder each time he passed the figure. Until one night, Thomas realized with growing horror that the whispers were not just names. They were warnings. It wasn't until that fateful night that Thomas truly understood the gravity of the situation. As he stood in the cemetery, his eyes scanning the darkness for the figure, the whispers suddenly stopped. The stillness that followed was suffocating. He turned slowly, dread gnawing at his insides. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the figure, standing as it always did, motionless. But this time, something was different. The figure's head tilted upward slightly, and its eyes locked onto Thomas. There was a coldness in the air, an unnatural chill that wrapped itself around his bones. For the first time since his encounters, the figure spoke. Thomas Mallory, the voice was a soft, eerie whisper. A sound like dry leaves skittering across the ground. You are next. Thomas froze. His body turned ice cold. His breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. The figure did not just mark the dead, it foretold the death of those it chose. And tonight, it had chosen him. The figure stepped forward, its dark presence growing as it moved closer. It is time, it whispered again. And Thomas, overwhelmed by the terror, turned to run. His heart pounded in his chest, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier with each step. But no matter how fast he ran, the figure remained behind him, its hollow gaze never faltering. In his panic, Thomas bolted from the cemetery, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. His mind screamed for him to run, but the terror he felt was all-consuming. His heart pounded, and his breath was short. Every corner he turned, every street he ran down, felt like he was being pulled deeper into an inescapable nightmare. As he reached the edge of town, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure right behind him. But there was nothing, no shadow, no dark presence. The streets were empty. The only sound the echo of his frantic footsteps. He dared to believe he had escaped. But as he looked down, his blood ran cold. Standing just a few steps away, in the graveyard beside him, was the figure, its hollow eyes fixed on him, unblinking. No matter how far he ran, it was always waiting for him. The figure never stopped, never relented. Thomas's knees buckled beneath him as the crushing weight of his fate settled in. He could run no more. The following morning, Thomas was gone. The small town woke up to the quiet of an ordinary day, with no sign of the caretaker who had tended to the cemetery for years. People in the village didn't ask questions. They just assumed he had gone away. But the cemetery, once a place of solace, was now a place of fear. Days later, a curious neighbor, Mrs. Hamilton, walked over to check on Thomas. But when she knocked on his door, there was no answer. The house was eerily still, the windows dark. Hesitant but driven by an unsettling feeling, Mrs. Hamilton ventured inside. The house was empty. Not a trace of life within. Everything was untouched, as if the caretaker had simply vanished. Her eyes landed on the mirror in the hallway. As she stared into it, she saw an image, faint at first, but growing clearer. In the reflection, Thomas stood. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with fear, as if he were trying to warn her. He was staring right at her through the mirror. But when she looked behind her, there was no one there. Suddenly, his expression changed. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. And behind him, the figure appeared. It stood in the reflection, its hollow eyes locked on Mrs. Hamilton. She recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure had followed Thomas, and now it had found her. The following morning, Thomas was gone. The small town woke up to the quiet of an ordinary day, with no sign of the caretaker who had tended to the cemetery for years. People in the village didn't ask questions. They just assumed he had gone away. But the cemetery, once a place of solace, was now a place of fear. The town would never be the same. Those who dared enter the cemetery reported seeing shadows moving in the graveyard. Figures that flickered and vanished as quickly as they appeared. Some swore they saw Thomas, his spirit, trapped, staring from the shadows with the same hollow, lifeless eyes. But no one could explain what happened to him, or the figure that haunted the cemetery. And in the quiet corners of the town, those who dared to look into a mirror would sometimes see the figure there too. Its hollow eyes would meet theirs. Waiting. Weeks turned into months. And though the town gradually fell back into its routines, an unspoken dread lingered, woven into the fabric of daily life. The cemetery remained empty and desolate, its gates creaking in the wind, a silent warning to those who passed by. People dared not enter its grounds, especially as twilight descended, and the shadows grew longer. Some townsfolk whispered that Thomas's ghost was now among the restless souls, forced to wander the grounds he had once cared for, his spirit unable to find peace. Others insisted that the dark figure had moved on, finding another soul to haunt, to torment. But the most terrifying belief was one shared only in hushed tones, that the figure was still waiting in the cemetery, marking the next soul it would claim, just as it had done with Thomas. One night, Mrs. Hamilton, the neighbor who had found Thomas's empty home, glanced at her own reflection in the window. The darkened glass caught her tired face. But as she moved to turn away, something froze her in place. Just over her shoulder, she glimpsed a faint outline, a tall, shadowy figure with empty, hollow eyes staring straight at her. She gasped and whirled around. But her room was empty. Heart racing, she looked back at the glass, only to see her own reflection staring back. The shadow nowhere to be seen. But the fear remained, deep in her bones. She had seen it. She was sure of it. and the horror she had felt that night never left her. She found herself avoiding mirrors at night, never wanting to risk seeing that dark, empty gaze fixed upon her again. She knew, as did the others in town, that the cemetery watcher was still out there, bound to the cemetery but somehow able to find anyone it desired. In the years that followed, the townspeople spoke of the legend only in hushed whispers, and no one dared enter the cemetery alone. They passed down the tale of the cemetery watcher from one generation to the next, warning children to stay away from the shadows and to avoid looking into darkened mirrors at night, lest they catch a glimpse of the figure's unblinking gaze, waiting and watching for them. And so, the legacy of the cemetery watcher endured, a chilling reminder that, even in a small, quiet town, there were forces beyond understanding, and some horrors were not meant to be disturbed. The figure remained, unseen but always felt, a silent and relentless watcher, forever lurking in the shadows. Story 2. The Smith family is a happy family, consisting of John, the father, Mary, the mother, and their 2 children, Jack and Emily. One day, they decide to visit a fall festival in a strange town. Excitement fills the air as they drive into the town, exploring the colorful booths, delicious snacks, and the lively atmosphere of the festival. Amidst the laughter and cheer, they notice an area at the edge of the festival, hidden in a secluded corner, seemingly separated from the rest. It is the House of Mirrors, an old mirror maze. This area is not as brightly decorated as the other booths. Instead, it appears dilapidated, with dim, flickering lights and an eerie, strange atmosphere. However, this only fuels the family's curiosity. "Let's go check it out," John says, as if it were a natural decision. The family holds hands and steps inside, smiles on their faces as they prepare to experience something new. But the moment they cross the threshold, the atmosphere immediately changes. Inside the maze, dusty mirrors are everywhere, many with long cracks running across them like scars. The space is so dark that it seems like all sounds from outside have been blocked, creating an eerie silence. The strange, cold air makes the family feel as if they are surrounded by an invisible, haunting presence. At first, the family laughs at the distorted images of themselves in the mirrors. They see strange versions of themselves, as if other versions of them are smiling back from within the mirrors. But it doesn't take long for the joy to fade as they realize something very strange. The reflections are not just distorted, but they are demonic versions of themselves, with twisted smiles and hollow, empty eyes. The mirrors in the maze seem to have a life of their own. Not only do they reflect the family's images in odd ways, but they also make each person feel as if an invisible entity is watching them. When Mary stops in front of a mirror to fix her hair, she suddenly sees a figure standing behind her. She turns around quickly, but no one is there. Yet in the mirror, the figure continues to smile at her, its eyes haunting. As the family moves through the maze, they realize that each mirror reflects a different, more disturbing version of them. Jack sees himself in the mirror, but with a grotesque face, dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept for days. With a maddening smile, Emily, the daughter, sees herself in a pure white dress, but her face is that of a corpse, her eyes lifeless, her skin pale. Each family member's fear grows as they realize these images seem not just to reflect them, but to have an intention of overpowering them. The fear escalates when they notice that sometimes their reflections don't move with them. Once, when John raises his hand to check his reflection, he notices that in the mirror, his hand doesn't move. Instead, his reflection remains still, staring back at him with blank, unfeeling eyes. At that moment, the family hears a shrill laugh echoing from deep within the maze. Someone, or something, is in the maze with them. And clearly, it does not intend to let them leave easily. As the fear spreads, the family tries to hold hands and find their way out. But at that moment, Jack suddenly sees a strange light emanating from a large mirror ahead. The light is faint and ethereal, drawing Jack in, unable to resist. Before anyone can stop him, Jack walks towards the mirror, and a horrific scream rings out as he is pulled into it. The last image the family sees is Jack's terrified eyes, before he disappears completely, leaving only a chilling reflection of him in the mirror. With deep, black eyes, John and Mary call out to Jack in panic. But there is no response. They look into the mirror, horrified to see their own reflections mocking them. With cold, hollow eyes, terrified, they grab Emily's hand and run deeper into the maze, hoping to find Jack and an escape. While searching, Mary feels a cold hand touch her shoulder. She spins around, but no one is there. Only her reflection in a nearby mirror remains. But strangely, her reflection does not look like her. It appears older, with deep-set eyes and a face full of wrinkles, as if she had been through decades of suffering. When she hurriedly turns away, in the final moment, her reflection winks, sending a sinister greeting. Soon after, Emily is also pulled into another mirror when they aren't paying attention. Now, only John and Mary are left, and fear has completely taken control. Every time they look into a mirror, they see the figures of their family members, but with twisted faces and eyes empty like the dead. Only John remains in the dark, silent maze. The voices of his family echo from the mirrors around him, like whispers from another world. But when he rushes to each mirror to find them, the images disappear as if they had never existed. He begins to realize that all the reflections in the mirrors are no longer his loved ones, but evil spirits, disguised and trying to lure him into a trap within this dreadful maze. When he looks into a large mirror ahead, he is horrified to see himself reflected as an old, frail man. His face looks pained, with deep wrinkles, hollow eyes, and cracked, bloodied lips. In that moment, the image seems to whisper to him, the voice echoing loudly in his ears, "You will stay here forever." Unable to believe his eyes, John turns away and runs in panic. But his steps become heavier with each movement. The mirrors around him begin to shake, closing in around him. Each mirror reflects not only his distorted image but also the ghostly figures of his family, Jack, Emily, and Mary, with empty eyes and swaying bodies like puppets. In his panic, John realizes that each mirror is a gateway to a terrifying world, and his loved ones are trapped inside it forever. He desperately tries to break a mirror, but all his efforts are in vain. The mirrors only tremble slightly but remain intact. Then, suddenly, the reflections in the mirrors begin to laugh eerily. The sound grows louder, merging into a sinister, mocking laugh that echoes from all directions. Finally, John desperately looks into a large mirror in front of him. In the mirror, his family is standing there, reaching out to pull him inside. But as he reaches out, the hand in the mirror grabs him with immense force. He feels himself being pulled in, his body slowly vanishing into the cold darkness, the air thinning, and John hears his last breath, weak and fading, until everything is consumed by an endless. Only John remains in the dark, silent maze. The voices of his family echo from the mirrors around him, like whispers from another world. But when he rushes to each mirror to find them, the images disappear as if they had never existed. He begins to realize that all the reflections in the mirrors are no longer his loved ones, but evil spirits, disguised and trying to lure him into a trap within this dreadful maze. The next morning, the festival ends, and the House of Mirrors is dismantled, as if it had never existed. No one remembers whether they saw the Smith family leave. Only a vague feeling spreads throughout the town that something strange had happened. A few days later, in the Smith's house, everything remains quiet. But when a curious neighbor knocks on the door, there is no answer. Lee, the woman living next door, feels something is off because the Smith family was always friendly. She decides to open the door and check. The house is eerily still, everything looking as if the family had never returned. But the strangest thing is when she looks into a mirror on the wall. She catches a glimpse of the Smith family, John standing in front, his face pale, eyes empty, and the children behind him with distorted faces. All of them are staring directly at her through the mirror, grinning eerily. Lee screams and turns to run. But before she leaves, she briefly sees her own reflection in the mirror, distorted, aged, with a grotesque smile like the Smith family's. From that day on, the people living around the house can sense a strange presence. Whenever someone looks into a mirror in the house, they see the image of the Smith family lurking behind, their hollow eyes as if trying to pull them into the world of mirrors, a world from which no one can escape once they enter. They are forever the lurking ghosts, waiting for the next victim to fall into the endless whirlpool of mirrors. Story 3. Weeks turned into months, and though the town gradually fell back into its routines, an unspoken dread lingered, woven into the fabric of daily life. The cemetery remained empty and desolate, its gates creaking in the wind, a silent warning to those who passed by. People dared not enter its grounds, especially as twilight descended, and the shadows grew longer. Some townsfolk whispered that Thomas's ghost was now among the restless souls, forced to wander the grounds he had once cared for, his spirit unable to find peace. Others insisted that the dark figure had moved on, finding another soul to haunt, to torment. But the most terrifying belief was one shared only in hushed tones, that the figure was still waiting in the cemetery, marking the next soul it would claim, just as it had done with Thomas. One night, Mrs. Hamilton, the neighbor who had found Thomas's empty home, glanced at her own reflection in the window. The darkened glass caught her tired face, but as she moved to turn away, something froze her in place. Just over her shoulder, she glimpsed a faint outline, a tall, shadowy figure with empty, hollow eyes staring straight at her. She gasped and whirled around, but her room was empty. Heart racing, she looked back at the glass, only to see her own reflection staring back. The shadow nowhere to be seen, but the fear remained, deep in her bones. She had seen it. She was sure of it. And the horror she had felt that night never left her. She found herself avoiding mirrors at night, never wanting to risk seeing that dark, empty gaze fixed upon her again. She knew, as did the others in town, that the cemetery watcher was still out there, bound to the cemetery but somehow able to find anyone it desired. In the years that followed, the townspeople spoke of the legend only in hushed whispers, and no one dared enter the cemetery alone. They passed down the tale of the cemetery watcher from one generation to the next, warning children to stay away from the shadows and to avoid looking into darkened mirrors at night, lest they catch a glimpse of the figure's unblinking gaze, waiting and watching for them. And so, the legacy of the cemetery watcher endured, a chilling reminder that, even in a small, quiet town, there were forces beyond understanding, and some horrors were not meant to be disturbed. The figure remained, unseen but always felt, a silent and relentless watcher, forever lurking in the shadows. As the car rolled deeper into the fog-drenched road, Lily stirred awake in the back seat and peered out of the window. Her eyes widened as she saw something up ahead.